The elevator climbed silently to the 42nd floor of Meridian Capital's glass tower in downtown Chicago. I adjusted the simple silver bracelet on my wrist, a data visualization charm my daughter had 3D printed for me, showing market volatility patterns from the 2008 crash. To most people, it looked like abstract jewelry. To me, it was a reminder that numbers don't lie, even when everyone else refuses to listen. The elevator doors opened, revealing the marble-lined reception of the firm that had once laughed me out of the building. They'd called my market predictions feminine hysteria, and my analytical models lucky guesses. Today, exactly 18 months later, their quarterly board meeting was about to begin, and I wasn't here as the dismissed junior analyst anymore. I was here as the woman who'd been right about everything they'd ignored. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The Meridian Capital lobby buzzed with the controlled chaos of quarterly earnings week. Men in charcoal suits clustered around coffee stations, discussing tech valuations and interest rate projections. Their voices carried that particular blend of confidence and anxiety that comes right before major financial announcements. I walked through the familiar space, my navy blazer and simple flats a stark contrast to the designer heels clicking around me. The leather portfolio in my hand contained documents they'd never expect to see. My data bracelet caught the morning light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. 17 tiny silver spheres representing the market indicators I'd been tracking for 2 years. At the reception desk, a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair looked up expectantly. "Can I help you?" "I'm here for the quarterly presentation," I said simply. She glanced at her screen, then at my understated appearance. "Are you with the catering company? The client services meeting is on 38, but vendor check-in is actually—" "I'm not catering," I interrupted gently. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen. I should be on your visitor list." Her manicured fingers flew across the keyboard. A frown creased her brow. "I'm sorry, I don't see—" "Oh wait." Her expression shifted slightly. "Dr. Chen from Pacific Analytics. You're here for the board presentation?" I nodded. She handed me a visitor badge, her confusion obvious. Pacific Analytics was clearly on the list, but I wasn't what she'd expected. "Conference room Meridian is on the 42nd floor. Take the executive elevator on your left." As I walked toward the elevator bank, I passed the wall of framed achievements and partner photographs. 2 years ago, my analysis had predicted the exact scenario they were living through now. They'd dismissed it as intuitive guesswork rather than rigorous data science. The elevator hummed upward, and I found myself remembering the last time I'd made this journey. That day, I'd been carrying a termination letter and a banker's box of personal items. Today, I carried something far more valuable, proof that I'd been right all along. The doors opened to reveal the executive floor's gleaming hallway. Abstract art lined the walls, each piece probably worth more than most people's annual salaries. At the far end, through glass conference room doors, I could see figures already gathering around the massive mahogany table. I checked my phone. 9:47 a.m. The presentation would begin in 13 minutes, right on schedule for what would become the most expensive meeting in Meridian Capital's history. The conference room was a study in corporate intimidation. 20-foot ceilings, panoramic city views, and a table that could seat 30. About 15 people were already present, their conversations creating a low murmur of industry jargon and market speculation. I took a seat near the middle of the table, close enough to be relevant but not presumptuous. The leather chair was exactly as I remembered, designed to make you feel either very powerful or very small, depending on which side of the conversation you were on. "Excuse me," a woman in her mid-40s with silver-streaked hair approached. Margaret Blackwood, Senior Vice President of Strategic Planning. I remembered her well. "Are you the presentation coordinator? We need the quarterly projections loaded before Robert arrives." "I'm actually here for the presentation," I said, indicating my nameplate. "Dr. Sarah Chen, Pacific Analytics." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, processing. "Pacific Analytics. You're the consulting firm?" "That's correct." She glanced at my simple bracelet, then back at my face. "Interesting. I was expecting someone more seasoned." This is a rather complex financial analysis we're discussing today. Before I could respond, two men in their 50s joined the conversation. David Morrison, head of risk assessment, and James Fletcher, chief investment officer. Both had been present during my final meeting here 2 years ago. The analytics consultant? David asked, extending a hand. I'm David Morrison. I have to say, your firm's preliminary report was quite optimistic about our current position. James chuckled. Optimistic is generous. Some of those predictions seemed almost wishful thinking, very creative interpretations of the data. I smiled politely. Sometimes the data tells us things we don't want to hear. Oh, I'm sure, Margaret said, her tone carrying just enough condescension to make her point. Though we've found that quantitative models often miss the nuanced realities of market behavior, there's something to be said for institutional experience and proven judgment. David nodded sagely. Exactly. Markets aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They're driven by human psychology, relationships, insider knowledge. Things you can't really quantify with algorithms. What we call gut instinct, James added with a knowing smile. Some people have it, others rely too heavily on computer models. I fingered the data bracelet on my wrist, each sphere representing a different economic indicator that had been flashing warning signals for months. I find that data and instinct often align when you know how to read the patterns. Margaret laughed lightly. Patterns. Yes. Well, that's the thing about patterns. People tend to see them everywhere, even when they're not really there. It's almost like a feminine intuition thing, if you know what I mean. The comment hung in the air for a moment. David and James exchanged glances that said they absolutely knew what she meant. Pattern recognition is actually a core component of advanced analytics, I replied evenly. When you have enough data points, trends become quite clear. Of course, James said, with the practiced diplomacy of someone humoring a child. Though I think you'll find that our internal analysis paints a rather different picture. We've been doing this for quite a while. A younger man approached the group, Tyler Harrison, one of the junior analysts who'd started just before I left. He'd always been friendly, if somewhat patronizing. Dr. Chen, wow, I didn't expect to see you here. His enthusiasm seemed genuine, if surprised. How's the consulting world treating you? Quite well, I said. Pacific Analytics has been growing steadily. That's great, really great. He glanced around the group. Dr. Chen used to work here, actually. Really smart analyst. Had some pretty interesting theories about market volatility. Margaret's expression shifted to mild interest. Oh, you're a former employee? I was, I confirmed. And now you're back as a consultant. How? Circular. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Though I suppose external perspectives can be valuable, even if they're not always grounded in our specific market realities. David checked his watch. Robert should be here any minute. This should be an interesting presentation. I'm curious to see how external analysis compares to our internal projections. Especially since the external analysis seemed so. James paused, searching for the diplomatic word, contrarian to our current position. I adjusted my bracelet, feeling the weight of each data point it represented. In 12 minutes, Robert Meridian himself would walk through those doors. In 15 minutes, my presentation would begin. And in exactly 37 minutes, according to my models, the first domino would fall in what would become the most significant market correction of the decade. They had no idea what was coming, but the data had been screaming it for months, if only they'd been willing to listen. 2 years ago, I'd sat in this exact conference room with a different set of faces around the same imposing table. The memory came flooding back as I watched the current group settle into their seats, the same air of unshakable confidence filling the space. I'd been their senior quantitative analyst then, one of only 3 women in the entire analytics department. My models had been generating concerning signals for months. Over-leveraged positions in the tech sector, derivative exposure that didn't match risk assessments, and correlation patterns that suggested a significant correction was building. The presentation I'd given that day had been the culmination of 6 months of painstaking analysis. I'd identified 17 key indicators that, when combined, painted a picture of systematic vulnerability across their entire portfolio. My recommendation had been simple. diversify immediately, reduce tech exposure by 60%, and hedge against volatility with specific defensive positions. Robert Meridian had listened politely as I walked through 43 slides of data visualization, correlation matrices, and predictive modeling. When I finished, the room had fallen silent for exactly 12 seconds. I'd counted. Then the questions began. "Sarah," Robert had said, his voice carrying that particular tone reserved for correcting junior staff, "this analysis seems to suggest that our entire investment strategy is fundamentally flawed." "That's quite a claim." "The data indicates significant risk concentration," I'd replied carefully. "Not flawed strategy, but perhaps adjustment needed for changing market conditions." David Morrison had leaned forward. "But these models are based on historical patterns, aren't they? Markets evolve. Past performance doesn't predict future results." "That's true," I'd acknowledged, "but these aren't just historical correlations. These are real-time indicators showing current vulnerabilities." Margaret Blackwood had shuffled through the printed slides. "I have to say, Sarah, some of these conclusions seem quite dramatic. A 60% reduction in our tech holdings? That would essentially mean abandoning our core growth strategy." "The risk-reward ratio has shifted significantly," I'd explained. The data shows what you've programmed it to show," James Fletcher had interrupted. "But markets aren't spreadsheets. They're driven by human behavior, institutional knowledge, relationships we've built over decades." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "James makes a good point. Sarah, your analytical skills are impressive, but I wonder if you're perhaps overthinking this. Sometimes experience and intuition are worth more than complex algorithms." The dismissal had been polite but absolute. "Women's intuition" became the phrase they used in meetings I wasn't invited to anymore. I'd heard it through office gossip, seen it in the way conversations stopped when I entered rooms, felt it in the sudden marginalization of my work. 3 months later, budget cuts had eliminated my position. Restructuring, they'd called it, streamlining analytics for greater efficiency. The severance package had been generous, the departure cordial, the message clear. My kind of thinking didn't fit their culture. But I hadn't disappeared into obscurity. My severance had become seed money for Pacific Analytics. Working from a cramped office in Lincoln Park, I'd continued tracking the same indicators that Meridian had dismissed. I'd published papers, built models, and attracted a small but growing client base of firms willing to pay for unconventional analysis. The data bracelet on my wrist had been a gift from my daughter Emma on my first anniversary as an independent consultant. She'd taken my market volatility models and transformed them into physical art. 17 silver spheres, representing the key indicators I tracked. "So you can wear your genius, Mom," she'd said. "And remember that being different doesn't mean being wrong." 6 months after leaving Meridian, my models had predicted the dot-com bubble burst with 87% accuracy. 8 months later, I'd called the housing market instability that led to mortgage-backed securities problems. 12 months later, 3 major investment firms were quietly using modified versions of my algorithms. But Meridian Capital had continued on their original trajectory, dismissing external warnings as overly cautious and, quote, lacking market sophistication. Their tech-heavy portfolio had grown aggressively, their derivative positions had expanded, and their risk assessment had remained rooted in relationship-based intuition rather than data-driven analysis. Now, 18 months after they'd shown me the door, every single indicator I'd identified was flashing red. The correction I'd predicted was no longer theoretical. It was happening in real time, starting at exactly 10:15 a.m., when the first earnings report would trigger a cascade of algorithmic selling. They'd called it women's intuition. Today, they'd learn it was simply superior analysis that they'd been too proud to accept. The conference room door opened, and Robert Meridian stepped inside, his presence immediately commanding attention. He looked exactly as I remembered, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, radiating the quiet confidence of someone who'd never been fundamentally wrong about anything important. He scanned the room, his gaze pausing briefly on me before moving on. No recognition yet. That would come soon enough. "Good morning, everyone," he said, taking his seat at the head of the table. "Let's begin with our quarterly review, and then move to the Pacific Analytics presentation." I'm particularly interested in this external perspective on our current position. I opened my laptop and felt the familiar weight of data and preparation. In 10 minutes, I would show them exactly what their feminine intuition had been trying to tell them for 2 years. The clock on the wall read 10:04 a.m. 11 minutes until their world changed forever. Dr. Chen, whenever you're ready, Robert said, gesturing toward the presentation screen. I stood and connected my laptop, feeling the familiar buzz of confidence that came with having irrefutable data. The first slide appeared, Meridian Capital Portfolio Analysis, Critical Risk Assessment. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Thank you for having me, I began, clicking to a clean, professional layout showing their current holdings. Over the past 18 months, Pacific Analytics has been monitoring specific indicators relevant to your portfolio composition. David Morrison looked skeptical already. We conduct our own risk assessments quarterly. They've consistently shown strong positioning across all sectors. I'm sure they have, I replied smoothly. However, my analysis focuses on correlation patterns that traditional assessments often miss. The next slide showed a network diagram, interconnected nodes representing their various holdings, with red lines indicating dangerous correlations. It was beautiful in its clarity, terrifying in its implications. Margaret leaned forward, studying the visual. This suggests our diversification isn't as effective as our models indicate. Exactly. When you look at the underlying algorithms driving these investments, they're all responding to the same market signals. What appears to be diversification is actually amplified exposure. James Fletcher's expression had shifted from polite attention to genuine interest. These correlation coefficients, are they current? As of this morning's opening bell. I clicked to the next slide, a timeline showing increasing volatility across their key positions. These 17 indicators have been building for months. Tyler Harrison suddenly looked up from his phone, his face pale. Dr. Chen, are you seeing the TechFlow earnings report that just came out? The room turned to him. TechFlow was one of Meridian's largest holdings, comprising nearly 12% of their growth portfolio. They missed projections by 37%, Tyler continued, his voice tight. The stock is down 18% in pre-market trading. A murmur ran through the room. Margaret was already pulling up market data on her tablet. That's unusual. Their guidance was very optimistic just last quarter. I clicked to my next slide, which showed TechFlow's risk profile from my analysis. TechFlow was flagged as a high-risk position 3 months ago, overvalued by approximately 40% based on revenue-to-growth ratios. David stared at the screen. You predicted this specific drop? Not this specific drop, I clarified. But TechFlow was one of 17 positions I identified as critically overexposed. I clicked again, showing all 17 companies highlighted in red. Each represents a potential trigger point for broader portfolio impact. Robert's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, frowned, then looked back at my presentation. Continued Dr. Chen. The concern isn't individual company performance, I said, moving to a slide showing algorithmic trading patterns. It's how algorithmic trading will respond to these signals. When one major position drops significantly, automated systems begin reassessing correlated holdings. As if summoned by my words, Tyler's phone chimed again. Synergy Tech is down 12%. That's 2 of our major tech holdings dropping simultaneously. The energy in the room had completely shifted. What had started as polite skepticism was becoming focused attention. Margaret was frantically checking other positions. James was pulling up trading algorithms on his laptop. Dr. Chen, Robert said, his voice carefully controlled, your analysis suggested this was going to happen today? My models indicated a high probability of cascade selling beginning between 10:15 and 10:30 a.m. Eastern, triggered by earnings disappointments in over-leveraged tech positions. I glanced at the wall clock, 10:18 a.m. We're currently 3 minutes into the predicted window. David Morrison was staring at his screen in disbelief. Quantum Industries is down 8%. Next-Gen Solutions down 15%. These are all positions flagged in my analysis, I finished. each connected through algorithmic trading patterns that create amplified selling pressure. Margaret looked up from her tablet, her earlier condescension completely gone. How extensive is this going to be? I clicked to a slide showing projected impact across their entire portfolio. Based on current holdings and correlation analysis, I estimate 16 to 23% portfolio value loss by market close, assuming no immediate defensive action. The room fell silent except for the soft chiming of phone notifications as more bad news arrived. Tyler's voice was barely above a whisper. Cloud Tech down 19%, DataStream down 14%. Robert stood slowly, his composure cracking for the first time. Dr. Chen, you're telling us that you predicted this entire scenario? The models predicted systematic vulnerability, I said carefully. What's happening now is the actualization of risks that were quantifiable months ago. James Fletcher looked like he was about to be sick. Our algorithms, they're all responding to the same signals. We're going to get caught in a feedback loop. Already happening, Tyler confirmed, his face grim. Automated selling is accelerating across all our major tech positions. I clicked to my final slide, recommended immediate actions. The list was short, precise, and would have prevented everything they were watching unfold in real time. Margaret stared at the recommendations, then at me. This is the same analysis you wanted to present 2 years ago, isn't it? The room turned to look at me. Recognition was finally dawning on several faces. A version of it, I confirmed. The underlying vulnerabilities have been building for quite some time. Robert was quiet for a long moment, watching his phone display increasingly dire market updates. When he looked up, his expression had changed completely. Dr. Chen, he said slowly, I believe we need to talk. You're Sarah Chen, Robert said, the recognition finally complete. You worked here. You gave this exact presentation 2 years ago. The silence in the room was profound. Margaret's face had gone pale. David Morrison was staring at me like I'd materialized from thin air. James Fletcher looked like he was calculating exactly how much money had just evaporated from their portfolios. I did work here, I confirmed calmly. Senior Quantitative Analyst, 2019 to 2022. Tyler Harrison's eyes widened. Wait, you're Sarah Chen? The one who created the volatility prediction models that everyone's been talking about in the industry journals? Among other things, yes. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. We dismissed your analysis. We called it women's intuition, I finished for her. I remember. The weight of that phrase hung in the air like a physical presence. Robert closed his eyes briefly, as if the memory was causing him pain. Dr. Chen, he said carefully, your current firm, Pacific Analytics, has been tracking these exact indicators for 18 months, I interrupted gently. We've been monitoring Meridian's portfolio as a case study in systematic risk concentration. David looked up from his phone, his face ashen. The portfolio's down 21% in 30 minutes. I nodded, within the projected range. James Fletcher's voice cracked slightly. How much further does this go? I clicked back to my impact analysis slide. Based on current algorithmic trading patterns and market sentiment, I estimate the selling pressure will continue through lunch. Total portfolio impact by close should be between 28 and 34%. Jesus Christ, Margaret breathed. However, I continued, there are still mitigation strategies available, not to prevent the immediate losses, but to minimize continued exposure. Robert leaned forward intently. What kind of strategies? Selective position closures, strategic short positions to hedge remaining long exposure, and immediate diversification into defensive sectors. I pulled up a new slide I'd prepared for this exact moment. Pacific Analytics has developed specific recommendations for portfolio recovery. Tyler was frantically calculating numbers on his phone. A 30% loss on our current assets under management. That's nearly $4 billion. The number hit the room like a physical blow. Dr. Chen, Robert said slowly, when you were here before, what would it have cost us to implement your original recommendations? I'd been waiting for this question for 2 years. Conservative estimate, your tech position rebalancing would have reduced potential gains by approximately 8% over the 18-month period. Cost of hedging positions would have been roughly $60 million in premiums and fees. Margaret did the math instantly. 60 million versus 4 billion. The numbers speak for themselves, I said simply. Robert stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. When he turned back, his expression was that of a man who'd just realized he'd made the most expensive mistake of his career. Dr. Chen, I need to ask you something directly, he said. Why are you here today? Why present this analysis now, when you could have simply watched us fail from a distance? I touched the data bracelet on my wrist, feeling the weight of each indicator sphere. Because despite everything, I believe in data-driven decision-making. And because my daughter reminded me that being right matters less than helping people make better choices. The room was quiet except for the continued chiming of phones delivering bad news. Also, I added, Pacific Analytics specializes in portfolio recovery strategies. We've developed specific methodologies for exactly this type of systematic correction. Robert's eyebrows raised slightly. You're offering to help us? Quote, I'm offering to do what I've always done, I replied. Provide accurate analysis and actionable recommendations. Whether you choose to implement them is entirely up to you. David Morrison looked up from his screen. Dr. Chen, your firm, how large is Pacific Analytics? Currently managing just over $2 billion in assets for institutional clients, I said. We've achieved an average 23% annual return over the past 18 months, with significantly lower volatility than market averages. The implications of that statement settled over the room like a blanket. Margaret spoke first. You've been outperforming us while we've been building toward this disaster. Tyler's phone chimed again. 32% portfolio loss now. It's accelerating. Robert returned to his seat, his decision-making mode fully engaged. Dr. Chen, what would it take to engage Pacific Analytics for immediate crisis management? I smiled slightly. That depends entirely on whether you're ready to trust what you previously dismissed as feminine intuition. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. 4 hours later, the Meridian Capital trading floor had been transformed into a coordinated response center. My team from Pacific Analytics worked alongside their traders, implementing the emergency strategies I'd outlined. The hemorrhaging had been stopped at 31% losses. Painful, but not fatal. Robert found me at a quiet corner desk, reviewing the day's execution reports. The afternoon light streaming through the windows painted everything in golden hues, a stark contrast to the morning's chaos. Dr. Chen, he said, settling into the chair beside me, I owe you an apology, several apologies actually. I looked up from my laptop. The market correction was predictable based on available data. No apologies necessary for disagreeing with analysis. That's not what I'm apologizing for, he said quietly. I'm apologizing for dismissing your expertise based on assumptions that had nothing to do with the quality of your work. I saved my document and turned to face him fully. I appreciate that. I want to offer you something, Robert continued. Chief Risk Officer position, full equity partnership, complete autonomy over risk assessment protocols. Name your compensation requirements. The offer hung in the air between us. 2 years ago, it would have been everything I wanted to hear. Now, it felt like an echo of a different person's dreams. That's a generous offer, I said carefully. But you're not interested. I smiled. Robert, Pacific Analytics has built something special. We work with clients who value data-driven insights from the beginning, not just during crisis management. We don't have to justify why correlation analysis matters or explain why algorithmic trading creates cascade risks. He nodded slowly. You've found clients who listen to you for the first time. More than that, we've built a culture where diverse analytical approaches are seen as strengths, not quirks to be tolerated. Margaret approached us, looking exhausted, but relieved. Dr. Chen, the defensive positioning is working. We've stabilized the bleeding, and some positions are actually recovering slightly. The market always overcorrects, I replied. Smart money recognizes opportunity in the chaos. She hesitated for a moment, then sat down across from us. I need to say something. What I said this morning about feminine intuition, that was wrong. Not just politically incorrect, but fundamentally wrong about how analysis works. Pattern recognition doesn't have a gender, I agreed. Your models saved us from complete disaster, Margaret continued. If we'd listened 2 years ago. We'd have missed some gains but avoided catastrophic losses, I finished. But that's in the past. The question now is how you move forward. Robert leaned back in his chair. What would you recommend? For moving forward, I mean. I pulled up a document I'd been working on throughout the afternoon. Pacific Analytics would be interested in a consulting partnership. Quarterly risk assessments, real-time monitoring of correlation patterns, and strategic advisory during market transitions. Not employment, Robert clarified. Partnership, I corrected, between equals. Tyler Harrison appeared at our table, his earlier panic replaced by focused determination. Dr. Chen, I've been studying your volatility models all afternoon. Would Pacific Analytics consider taking on junior analysts for training rotations? I considered the question. Tyler had always been respectful, even when the institutional culture around him hadn't been. We might be interested in a mentorship program. Analysts who want to learn data-driven risk assessment. Margaret's phone buzzed, and she glanced at it with surprise. The Financial Tribune wants to interview you about today's market correction. Apparently, word is spreading about your predictions. Pacific Analytics doesn't typically seek publicity, I said. Maybe that should change, Robert suggested. What happened today? Other firms need to hear this story. They need to understand what they're missing when they dismiss analytical perspectives that don't fit their traditional models. I touched my data bracelet, feeling the weight of each sphere representing today's vindication. My daughter had been right. Wearing your genius wasn't about showing off. It was about remembering who you are when everyone else tries to tell you who you should be. I'll consider the interview, I said finally. But the story isn't about being right when others were wrong. It's about the importance of listening to data, regardless of who's presenting it. As the sun set over Chicago, casting long shadows across the trading floor, I packed up my laptop and prepared to return to the Pacific Analytics offices. The day had been exhausting, vindicating, and strangely anticlimactic all at once. Robert walked me to the elevator. Dr. Chen, thank you for coming back, for helping us, for being professional about all of this. Data doesn't hold grudges, I replied, pressing the call button. And neither do I. The elevator doors opened, revealing the same space where I'd ridden up that morning. But everything had changed. I was no longer the dismissed analyst returning to prove a point. I was the CEO of a successful firm, offering partnership to former colleagues who had finally learned to listen. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, I pulled out my phone and typed a quick message to Emma. The bracelet worked perfectly today. Data and art make a powerful combination. Her response came immediately. Told you so, Mom. Genius looks good on you. Sometimes the most powerful statement is the one you never have to make out loud. Sometimes the data speaks for itself, and the people who matter finally learn to listen. The elevator doors opened to the marble lobby where my journey had begun 8 hours earlier. I walked through the revolving doors into the Chicago evening, knowing I'd never need to prove myself in that building again. But more importantly, knowing that the next time someone dismissed analytical expertise as feminine intuition, there would be 17 peer-reviewed papers and $4 billion in prevented losses to prove them wrong. The best revenge isn't personal vindication. It's professional excellence that speaks so loudly, even the deaf can hear it. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.